So again, good evening, everybody. My name is Monshin, Nannette Overley, and I'm a priest at Upaya. And I'd like to start by, in a very traditional way, by thanking my teachers. My first teacher, Catherine Thanis, and my current teacher, Eugene Bush, and Roshi Joan Halifax, who holds us all in the Dharma in this amazing Dharma Center. So, thank you. And then to provide a little context for my topic, we in this room and almost 500 other people online will be joining us to study the women ancestors for this practice period, which starts tomorrow. So this is like, what do they call it, a prequel? What do they call it in those films? Sneak preview. And the other person that I want to thank before speaking is the friend of Upaya and person and priest who actually initiated probably 2 years ago this theme for the practice period and invited me to join her and teach. And because of the virus, she's not in this room, she's home in the Netherlands, but Petra Zenryu was really the one who planted this seed, so I really want to thank her too. And the particular topic of my talk is called Our Zen Matriarchs Shout. So we'll get into that in a little while because there's this thing of the Zen shout, and we'll talk about what that is and then maybe the different flavor of it that we hear from the women ancestors. Somehow for me, from the very beginning of my time in Zen, I was fortunate enough to really be surrounded by wonderful, strong women teachers. And so it really wasn't in my focus and wasn't clear to me except intellectually how formed in a masculine and patriarchal spirit Zen has been. It's just, the spirit and the history as it was passed down to us. And because I always felt that all the teachers that I've had have made it so accessible to me, it wasn't something that I thought about. And a few years ago, and this is also something that was initiated by Petra, we started a monthly study group of women studying this book of stories of women ancestors, koan stories, and it's also with commentaries by women. And so over the course of the months, I really began to get a taste for this other element, other energy that I felt like really gave me a different access as a woman, but just also a fuller picture. It's like we need all the voices. We don't just need one flavor of voice. So let's talk about this thing of the Zen shout. And if you've been around Zen stories and Zen lore very long, I'm sure you've heard this. It's familiar to you in koan stories and other stories. This mystique of the shout, which has a couple different contexts or ways that it comes up. So, of course, when studying and looking into my questions for a Dharma talk, I went to the internet and started thinking about shout and what the origin just of the word is. And it was interesting because there's this combination of a loud expression, or to cry out loudly, to yell, to holler, to roar, to express strong emotions. But there's also a little bit of history of shout being scolding, or kind of like putting someone in their place, even before Zen. And then there's the Zen context of shout, which is the Japanese word for this is katsu. And the katsu is this deep shout from the hara. And so, unfortunately, I shouldn't make fun of this because I know that there's some value in it, but I found some YouTube videos of these different Zen masters doing the shout. And the problem is that kind of performing that is antithetical to actually what it is. Because what the shout represents in Zen is a completely unfiltered expression of a moment or of an understanding. And so to have a shout be something you perform, it just doesn't quite get there. It doesn't quite catch the spirit. And this kind of a Zen shout in stories was used two ways. One is just an expression, and the other was that it's used kind of as a way to wake another person up. And there's also scolding in there too, particularly, well, in many ways, there's this, shout kind of as a scolding. Many stories have this Zen shout. Linji, who's a Rinzai ancestor, was probably the most well-known for the Zen shout. And I'll read you like the shortest story I could find that is a story of the classic kind of Zen shout. So here it is. A monk asked, "What's the basic meaning of Buddhism?" The master gave a shout. The monk bowed low. The master said, "This fine monk is the kind who's worth talking to." So there's this recognition of a shout as an original expression. And the problem for me, it's just something in the stories that I could never quite find, never quite get to the essence of what that was, because all I could picture was this, this big, loud shout. Or the 30 blows, or the slap, or that kind of wake-up energy. So I really became curious about, so if there's such a thing as a woman ancestor's shout, what would that be? And how might it be different or not? Because there's lots of stories also. Most of the stories, the koans that we have, in fact, it's hard to find ones that aren't this way, come to us because it's the story of a monk or a master and their encounter with a woman. And so there's the classic tea ladies that kind of put the monks down, and the monks come showing off, and they have a turning word or a clever way or a harsh way or a scolding way of kind of putting them in their place. And that's a kind of a shout that comes through in the stories but I was really looking for what felt to me like this true, unfiltered, completely embodied expression of the Dharma in a moment. So I have 3 stories, and we won't have time to go deeply into all of them, but I hope you do in the course of the next month if you're in the practice period. And with these stories, sometimes it's hard to imagine the scene, but that's what I hope we'll do as we kind of settle into some of these stories. The first story is Ling Xiao, which is one of I love the stories about her. She was Layman Pang's daughter, and they had this Dharma family, and they would, it was kind of lovely. They ended up traveling all over the country, and Layman Pang would love to get into these Dharma combats with people and, with other masters that they encountered, and Ling Xiao would always kind of gently bring in a teaching that basically would cut through whatever they were saying. So let me read this story to begin, very short. And I'll say a few more things about it. Each of these stories are short, so I'm going to read them twice. And see if you can hear the shout in this story, the expression in this story. One day, Layman Pang and his daughter Ling Xiao were out selling bamboo baskets. Coming down off a bridge, the layman stumbled and fell. When Ling Xiao saw this, she ran to her father's side and threw herself on the ground. "What are you doing?" cried the layman. "I saw you fall, so I'm helping." "Luckily, no one was looking," remarked the layman. One day, Layman Pang and his daughter Ling Xiao were out selling bamboo baskets. Coming down off a bridge, the layman stumbled and fell. When Ling Xiao saw this, she ran to her father's side and threw herself to the ground. "What are you doing?" cried the layman. "I saw you fall, so I'm helping." "Luckily, no one was looking," remarked the layman. So the qualities of her expression here, a complete gesture, completely free, unhesitating, kind, intimate, unexpected, kind of unexplainable, a gesture that has everything included and nothing held back. And I hear a teaching about helping here, and what is helping, and who is the helper, and who is the helped. And a teaching about intimately coming alongside, about compassion and intimacy. In the Hidden Lamp, the person who does the commentary is Joan Sutherland, and she talks about a compassionate act by saying, in a compassionate act, we deliver a commitment to help liberate the intimacy already inherent in any situation. So Ling Xiao coming alongside and accompanying simply in a gesture just like that. And one of the things that impressed me about this story and others that I think is part of the essence of this thing that I'm calling a shout is that there's nothing held back. nothing held back. And, you know, I think of how I can give compassion, give my energy, give my commitment, and there's always something that I hold back. And, you know, it's like I can feel it. There's that little bit of myself that I don't throw in. It's kind of like, you know, how we chant when two arrow points meet head on. It's kind of like that. That's like nothing held back. And a story that I thought of that this reminded me of was a session that I did. That it was years ago. It was a really hard session for me, and I was like, I don't know what, day 5 or day 6, and I was so clear that I had this strong feeling that I just kept telling myself, I can't do, I'm just hanging on by a thread here. This is like what my mind was saying over and over. I'm hanging on by a thread. I'm hanging on by a thread. And suddenly, there was a teaching that came through from myself to myself that said, hanging on by a thread, let go. You just let go. And then, like, the suffering is gone. So this notion of giving everything away, I think is part of this full expression and something to really just kind of inquire about. So my next story is Shotaku's paper sword. And some of these stories you may have heard. They're all fabulous and fairly well known. Shotaku was the 3rd abbess of the Tokeiji convent. One evening, she was returning to Tokeiji from a nearby monastery when a man, armed with a sword, accosted her and threatened to rape her. She took out a piece of paper, rolled it up, and then thrust it like a sword at the man's eyes. He was completely overcome by her spiritual strength and was unable to strike her. He turned to run, and she gave him a Zen shout, hitting him and knocking him down with her quote-unquote sword. He fled. Shotaku was the 3rd abbess of the Tokeiji convent. One evening, she was returning to Tokeiji from a nearby monastery when a man, armed with a sword, accosted her and threatened to rape her. She took out a piece of paper, rolled it up, then thrust it like a sword at the man's eyes. He was completely overcome by her spiritual strength and was unable to strike her. He turned to run, and she gave him a Zen shout, hitting him and knocking him down with her quote-unquote sword. He fled. So this is 14th century Japan. And imagining such a scene, and in the story they say that she bested him with her spiritual strength. In the commentary, Nancy Mujo Baker says, actually, we all have that strength. Actually, we all have that strength. It's the same strength we see and use whenever we commit ourselves to something completely. Holding nothing back, full expression. whenever we commit ourselves to something completely. And this idea, again, of holding something back, it's like sometimes there's obvious reasons that we kind of hold back, like we're worried about approval, where we're wanting to avoid criticism, we're wanting to look good. And sometimes it's something more subtle. It's just that giving that level of 100% commitment, you actually give yourself away. There's like no reference points anymore. And you give up your sense of your separate self, which is why we don't do it. Which is why we hold on to something. So, after reading this story, what I wrote in my notes as I was considering this was this. One complete bow as the shout. She who gets up from that bow would be free, not holding anything back. Okay, my third and favorite story. This one, I just want to say, I really, really thought of Molly when reading this, and it has to do with how the teaching of the Dharma, the speaking of the Dharma is described. And there are a few really important points in this. This is called Xiang's Earth. A monk asked Master Xiang Shengru, who was the abbess of the monastery he was visiting, 30 blows, are they the actions of a man or an enlightened being? Xiang replied, just as long as the fellow isn't beaten to death. The monk said, when you speak, the congregation assembles like clouds. In the end, who is the great hero among women? Xiang said, each and every person has the sky over their head. Each and every person has the earth under their feet. The monk gave a shout. Xiang said, what's the point of recklessly shouting like that? The monk then bowed respectfully, and Xiang said, the Dharma does not rise up alone. It can't emerge without reliance on the world. If I take up the challenge of speaking, I must surely borrow the light and the dark, the form and the emptiness of the mountains and hills and the great earth, the call of the magpies and the cries of the crows. The water flows and the flowers blossom, brilliantly preaching without ceasing. In this way, there is no restraint. The Dharma does not rise up alone. It can emerge without reliance on the world. If I take up the challenge of speaking, I must surely borrow the light and the dark, the form and the emptiness of the mountains and hills and the great earth, the call of the magpies and the cries of the crows. The water flows and the flowers blossom, brilliantly preaching without ceasing. In this way, there is no restraint. So when asked about the hero, she slashes through the cult of the hero. We all have the sky above our head and the earth beneath our feet. And she slashes through the performance of the shout. And then offers such a different kind of all-inclusive and compassionate view of the Dharma. And to me, this is a true and full expression, with actually no trace of self. So we have these stories from our women ancestors. And in this talk and these stories and all the stories that we take up, I really urge us, especially those coming along with us this month, to not take them up as a history lesson or the feminist view. This is the Dharma, and it's something that we need to bring into this aching, difficult time of unknowing. We need to really bring it in, or we're just, why are we here? And I think we can ask ourselves how we can yield Shotaku's paper sword, like that spiritual strength. That strength is what we're here to cultivate. So I want to end with this dedication that's so dear to me. So I was in Santa Cruz for many years practicing, and we chanted the women ancestors kind of like, I think twice a week. We had our different chants that we would cycle through. And after chanting the women ancestors, there's a dedication after all our chants. And this was our dedication after we chanted the women ancestors. Now we have dedicated our practice to the great women teachers who have encouraged open-hearted devotion to the all-inclusive way. May our life reveal their compassion. Thankfully, we honor their true being. Thank you. So we'll chant the 4 vows.